Then. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the CAR webinar today. I'm Farhad Salimi, and I'm a postdoc at CAR, and will host the webinar today. Today's presenter is Dr. Ivan Hanigan, who is a multidisciplinary data manager and data analyst, and is currently a postdoc fellow at CAR. Ivan's current research focuses on health impacts of socioeconomic disadvantage, air pollution, and extreme weather events. I would like now to ask Ivan to start his seminar on data sharing and analysis platform using collaborative environment for scholarly research and analysis, COESRA. Just want to let you know that we will have about 10 minutes at the end of the seminar for Q&A. So Ivan, stage is yours.
Thanks, Farhad. I'm very excited to be presenting on this data sharing and analysis platform because it represents a change from the testing and development phase of the project, which has been going on for some months. And we are now presenting this as the public alpha version and moving it out of the beta testing phase. So this is a really exciting time. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues Guru and Kwan from UQ, who work in eco-informatics and computer science. And they've been instrumental in doing all of the programming behind COESRA. So I wanted to specify the focus of this talk in specifically about the broad environmental health and exposure science agenda, with some technical demonstrations of how this platform, this analysis platform, can help the scientists in that domain. This really differentiates us apart from a lot of the other data sharing platforms that are proliferating out there at the moment. You might have heard of Oren, and there's a bunch of other ones out there. So what the motivation and therefore the requirements of this sharing and analysis platform were really about the analysis of health and environmental factors, risk factors, and other risk factors, and especially the problematic nature of reproducibility of computer science. So that's the first bullet point, and that'll be a section of my talk. The second section is a review of some of the use cases of how research in population health and environmental data analysis happens, some of the challenges that are specific to the domain. The third section focuses in on a current particular priority, which is spatial data linkage, where we get exposure assessment data on whatever environmental or social risk factor we're interested in, and link that to the health outcome data and do the analysis. And especially I want to talk about point receptor exposure estimates, and I'll tell you more about what that means later. And then the next section, I'll describe the system which was designed and some of the design choices that we made. And it was all about this finding and sharing and analysis trifecta. I'll give you 3 use cases focusing on the point receptor estimates, as I mentioned, and then I'll conclude. I'll give some discussion of limitations and conclude. Before I get started on the whole talk, though, I wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining what I do as a data scientist in epidemiology. A lot of people say to me, you call yourself a data scientist, a statistician? And I say no. And that it's not a computer scientist either. In this Venn diagram, which is one of the ones that a lot of people use to describe data science, it's actually the intersection of computer science, statistics, and a substantive domain-specific topic. And so mine is epidemiology, having an undergraduate training in human ecology that led me to do my PhD in environmental epidemiology. So yeah, the particular focus of everything that I do is to bring in the computer science and the statistics to that. So the motivation leading me to work so much on an online sharing and analysis platform stems from an interest that I've had for a while in what's called the reproducibility crisis. And some of the issues in terms of turning the evidence that we create from this widespread use of multivariable regression studies, where we do association models between lots of variables that we have linked through multiple data sets, into evidence that we can use for causal inference and therefore make sensible policy recommendations. And if there's a reproducibility crisis where your results from a data analysis are difficult or impossible to reproduce, it kind of throws the veracity of your statements into a bit of doubt. And there's a lot of opinion-based argument about evidence at the moment. I think that it would be a lot simpler if we could point to some very rigorous numbers and say, if you're interested in the sensitivity of these, for example, there's a lot of intricate details to do with the methods and especially assumptions that are made. And if you want to verify or then extend and do similar different analyses, it can be quite difficult. I love this cartoon of the guy presenting his mathematical formula to his boss with the miracle clearly stated that it occurs in the middle somewhere, and that's how he got the great numbers, and the response that he really needs to be a bit more explicit in step 2. So I boiled it down from a few different sources in the literature, actually going back more than 10 years, to this process where an author of a data analysis meets up with the reader of the data analysis by distributing their analysis and their data to that person. It's got components that are really well understood, where you design your study based on your hypothesis, you measure some data, you turn that into something that you can analyze. This might be data linkage, data cleaning, missing data imputation, and a lot of this pre-processing. And it's great if you can code a lot of that, because that code will then be rerunnable on a computer system. Then the next step is to analyze the data and get your computational results. It's really important to code that, because this is the particular operation that is run on a particular computer with a particular data set to make some reproducible numbers and other things. So the blue dashed lines that go vertically are showing the flow of a data sharing process, and whereby it's not so important to share your measured data. In fact, it's probably very, very difficult, and it's unnecessary, because it's the analytic data that really needs to be shared, and so that's why it's got a blue dashed line. Likewise, the code that turns that into the computational results should be shared. As an option, you can also write code that turns computational results into the graphs and figures and the numeric results in the tables, and that can all be shared for a completely reproducible report, which, when shared with the reader along with the text of the report, which we normally just do as a journal article in a fairly static fashion, in the future, I think that a reproducible workflow will allow readers to completely run and reproduce the results and potentially check some sensitivities and ask new questions. So this is the guts of the reproducibility part of the process, sharing the analytical data and code. A bigger problem is in replication, and replication is not the same as reproducibility, because it involves measuring new data or refining your hypothesis and design to slightly modify what the data is that is being used to ask a question. And that will always lead to some variations because of measurement error or the randomness of the world, but ultimately a replication of a study will give the new researcher some agreement with the old researcher's findings. So that's really the guts of the motivation for having a system that pulls together the sharing and the analysis parts of the process. In general terms, I can summarize this as this set of dot points where a rigorous reproducibility study or system, allows you to find out about data easily and get the data somewhat easily if it's available. Put that data somewhere that you'll be able to find it down the track, because these studies can take sometimes years, where you're doing stuff with data over and over again, and that can be convoluted and protracted across months. So then you've got challenges of finding out what has been done with data, not only by yourself, but other people as well. And sharing the data with others compounds that problem, where they will get your data, put it somewhere, and wonder what has happened to it so far. Each of these activities, therefore, can be seen happening at an individual researcher level, a research group, centre, university, or multi-university collaborative groups such as the CRE that we're working for at CAR. So it's a pretty broad scope. But bringing it back to the specific point of what we were trying to do, the use cases of population health and environmental research are really the guiding principles that I wanted to base this on. So let's review what this is all about. This, I don't want to dwell on this kind of stuff because I know a lot of environmental health scientists are in the audience, but I do find it an important kind of step one in talking across the broad audience of people who are into data sharing. Really, the analysis that we're trying to get out at the end of the day for a lot of these studies is an exposure response function, which we hope represents the dose response relationship that is actually happening in the real world. Here's a stylized example of the effect of consuming alcohol. And we can estimate an effect estimate for that dose or exposure in a multivariable regression model of that kind of form. So we've got a lot of covariates. Some of these are known as confounders, and they're pretty problematic. And so we have to link a lot of different data sets together to get a really sophisticated understanding of what's going on. Some of these variables will modify the effect. I know that there's a lot of different ways to drink too much from personal experience, and other people I've seen can drink more than me, and so there's a lot of variables that need to be linked. Here's a specific example from my own work where we were looking at aeroallergens, pollen and fungus, and their association with the hospitalization rates for respiratory disease. COPD is a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it had a very linear relationship with the amount of pollen in the air on each day. The effect estimate is in the middle of the solid line. The 95% confidence intervals are represented by the dashed lines, and the marks on the x-axis are where the data are. So there's not a lot of days with high pollen above 80. But I'm using this example because as we step through and back into the guts of the analysis, we can see how this data set was constructed. Here's a map of the city of the hospital was servicing, and we had one primary sampler of pollen in the middle of the city and a secondary one outside the city. And so pulling these data sets together involved spatial data analysis methods that brought together health and population and other things like day of the week. And when we link it all together, we got this analyzable data set where the primary outcome of interest was the hospital admissions on the top there, and our primary exposure of interest was total pollen. And we also had fungus, different species of pollen, day of the week, school holidays, putting all this stuff together. Now, I don't want to labor the point, but I do want to get across this kind of what we call multifactorial causal influence framework that environmental epidemiology really needs to grapple with. And this diagram is showing different types of variables that we need to consider when we're just doing our associational regression modeling. In the top left, we've got confounding, and I use the example from my own work on suicide, where this is actually describing if your exposure of interest was altered social structure, which is a sociological question of very great interest and has been for a long time. You potentially can't ask that question in the absence of asking what the direct effect of drought is on suicide, and potentially the confounding effect where drought might be affecting the social structure, which would in turn be associated with a change in suicide rates, but not necessarily how you would think. Then we've got effect modifiers, where gender has been found to kind of modify the effect of social factors, and then causal intermediaries and colliders. In fact, pollen pops up again as a potential collider where it can change the resilience of gender. And down the bottom, I've just listed a few out that we'd also want to probably start to think about population at risk. This is kind of demography and how many people there are, and socioeconomic status of the neighbourhoods of the people that we're looking at, the population density of those neighbourhoods, house crowding, land use, whether or not it's agricultural or residential, remoteness and accessibility, walkability, road density, and the list goes on. So really what we're trying to get at is a vast multitude of data sets that are all floating around, getting linked together in a sharing and analysis platform. Beyond the complexity of adding in the social factors, the data actually has a bit of a structural challenge in terms of its spatio-temporal nature. Here is nitrogen dioxide over Sydney for a sequence of 6 hours in 2002, where it shows that where you would probably locate your participant in a study might not be the best place given what the exposures are doing. This is actually New Year's Eve, the 1st of the 1st. And so this is when people travel into the city and watch the fireworks. I know this because I've been in Sydney when this happens. And the plume of smoke and pollutants kind of drifts out over the city, and we can run these kinds of models hourly for years and move people around, and it gets very challenging to link it all up together. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Now the third section is about this current priority, which is spatial data linkage, and the system that I'm going to demonstrate has been focused on solving some of those problems. This is an oldie but a goodie. It made me feel old when I saw that the original citation for this was 1992. I don't know what I was doing in 1992, but I wasn't reading this. I only saw it in the 1997 book that I've got, luckily reproduced from 1992, and I haven't been able to find the 92 thing. But it's a great piece of historical geography, and it really gets to the gets across the broad range of things that we need to do. The y-axis is receptor, and so that's where the exposure we want to estimate the exposure at. And that could be a point, it might be someone's residential address or their workplace. It might be a line, the road that they travel along to get to work, or it might be an area. It could be the suburb that we know that they live in. We might not know their exact point location. And across the top, we've got the same set of things where the exposure might be measured at a point. These might be pollutant monitoring stations. It could be estimated from a line, that might be a road, and it could be measured at the area level like a lot of the census data is. So really looking across the number of studies that I've done, the majority of them needed just the A and the C, where you have point locations of people, and you might have pollutants at an area level or from points. So I'm going to demonstrate A and C, but I'll give a bit of a shout out to I down here as a particularly challenging thing to do, but all of these are challenging and varying across different studies. So when designing the system to meet this challenge, we broke it down into finding, sharing, and analyzing data. The first time I really sat down and thought about this very hard was in 2013 when we got a project funded by the Australian National Data Services. And this was the outcome. We built this system where we had data behind a firewall that was broken into the highly restricted data where you couldn't really access it at all, really. It had to be changed to an accessible format by an administrator. And then there's less restricted data that really just anyone can access, and so with the rules that we applied. And then we had a way to serve that through to the World Wide Web using HTTPS, which is a more secure kind of protocol for talking through the web. We had a data catalog that allowed people to find the stuff that we needed. We managed permissions on projects and who was the users, and the administrator did all that. and we also tracked the versions of all of the things. The important thing about this is that the system sits behind a firewall, and these clients, that's a person at a desk, and it has a particular association with the server client model. This grew into the next phase of my work with when I joined up with Guru and Kwan, and we were funded through TERN, which stands for Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, and an NCRIS-funded facility. And we were funded to develop a system which was focused on the IUCN Red List of Ecosystem Assessments, which is a climate change risk assessment for ecosystems. And it really was promoting data sharing amongst ecologists. It worked really well for data sharing. It was a very great tool that, it was a great development that integrated a lot of information that allowed us to access people's identities at different Australian universities and the CSIRO through the AAF. And Guru and Kwan worked out a large amount of the technical details of hosting this infrastructure on things like the Strudel web and Guacamole. And if you want to know more about that, I reckon you could have a good chat to Guru and Kwan later on. It was peer-reviewed, I know, by a computer scientist and an ecologist, and this is an international journal, so it's had a bit of scrutiny, and so it was pretty much a good thing. However, it doesn't really do private or restricted data access very well, because it's built on this kind of open system with lots of openness, and so anyone can get in there and do things with the open data. So that's a limitation in terms of what we want to do when we have these layers of restrictions that we wanted to build into the system. What it does do really well is it simplifies a lot of the data science toolkit, which involves a lot of specialist bespoke software. Often Linux operating systems work better for this kind of work. It gives you access to fast cores and more RAM than is generally available, and it's scalable. You can add more cores, more RAM to your virtual desktop. So I should mention it is basically another kind of remote desktop system where you get to open up your workspace. It looks like your desktop, but it's somewhere else, and you can add more cores and RAM to it when you need. So to have data sharing just amongst our collaboration and to make it all kind of authenticated to data sharing agreements, we actually had to do a bit more work. So that recently happened. It was funded through the CAR Exposure Science team, which we call CARROT. And that's led by Jeff Morgan and a bunch of other people. But Jeff forked out the money to pay the development of a new tool for managing the groups. So now any user who logs into CoEsra can request access to the CAR group, and our data manager will approve that person if that collaborator is known to be a person in CAR, and then they will have access to all of our general data sets straight away, both inside CoEsra directly, but also if they wanted to use it externally at their local computer, they can download the data easily via CloudStor from the World Wide Web. And this kind of data is the Bureau of Meteorology and the Australian Bureau of Statistics census data, and some of the pollution data that is in the public domain. We also hold a number of restricted access datasets that have been developed by collaborators as outputs of particular projects, and also anyone who's working on their own stuff, that data can be seen as restricted to themselves as well. And so we've got a process for making all of that stuff shareable with specific data sharing agreements, and we have been working hard at how to capture metadata and other administrative stuff that goes on. Now, talking about metadata, this slide starts with the quote that I really, really like. Standards are like toothbrushes. So everybody needs one, but nobody wants to use someone else's. And having been hanging around data portal projects for a while, they all do this. They all have their own kind of search for a standard that fits, find that it doesn't really work perfectly for them, start to modify it and come up with ways that it works for them in their local conventions and their naming systems. And this is great. This is how it basically has to work. We follow the ecological metadata language, EML, which is an international standard used mostly for ecology, but it really captures geography and time and a lot of various, yeah, it's not very specific like some of the other social science ones that I found seem to be a bit too rigid. It's also used by the TERN ecological network portal facilities, some of them. And so that's there's a community in Australia that are using it. And what I really liked about it is it helps to kind of structure how things are set up as projects, data sets, data entities, and it even defines data creators and owners for us. We set up a convention for folder structure and naming. And for the nerds out there, we use a mix of mnemonic and prefix, root, suffix. And we built a data inventory database, which is also based on the EML standard. And from it, we generate a web browser-based catalog so that people can search. And that's restricted to the members of the group. Here's a schema of the project dataset entity kind of framework that we use. And it's designed, well, this particular schema is showing a firewall so that people who are outside the firewall, like everyone starts with their data pretty much outside the firewall. This is someone with a particular study, an external person. They have raw data and they can load it in to the system, into a project which has data sets. And that would be kind of the data that was provided to the project. It might get worked on. And so new data is derived from it. And there might be a couple of data sets. So this might be the first wave of a study, and this might be the second, or this might be the health outcomes that were measured, and this might be biometric or demographic data that was collected and cleaned and imputed. And so derived data sets can then be merged in a subsequent project, which might take not only the derived data sets from this particular project, but also data from another project. So that might be the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We might have census data that was recoded. For example, socioeconomic status indicators might have been derived, and these can then be linked into a health outcome and a biometric and demographic file to derive some new data. In fact, it works as well with the secure unified research environment. Conceptually, we can develop a whole bunch of data from a exposure assessment phase of the project, feed it out into the very rigorously controlled authenticated gateway into Shore, do some work in the geoprocessing workspace, link that to the highly controlled CEF, and get out our results through that system. So that's the design. I want to take a little bit of diversion and compare it to the Oren data portal, which is a major player in this space. However, I don't think it can demonstrate quite as successful an approach to the analysis of data. And this is an example of the, this is a journal paper that was written by some of the leaders of the Oren group. And it's about conducting a spatial statistical analysis. The tools that they were using were designed to really do simple steps one at a time. And so this caused problems that they noted as major weaknesses in their own review in the data preparation phase. So they quote, a time-consuming process. It would have been faster if the groups could be extracted in one table. And the final table, unfortunately, has multiple columns, all with the label total, which was very confusing because they needed to do a style of mathematical operation that added several of the totals together and then divided by the grand total, which would have been much simpler if they could have done multiple operations, which is par for the course for a data analysis piece of software, which is what we actually start with in CoEsra. Now, that leads me to another criticism that they made of the Oren tools, which was that they are talking through a web user interface, and the tools, whilst they're operating really well in the back end, have had a bit of a problem actually going through the web user interface to the output. And so in this case, a spatial model was run, but the unformatted text file that you got at the end has columns that do not line up, and the columns, two of the columns were missing their headers, although the data was in the table. So they do point out that correcting this really only took about a minute, which is fine. But my point is that when I'm doing a data analysis in a real life study, I will do a large number of models where I'm checking parameterization and testing different techniques of imputation. And so I'll have multiple data sets that I want to fit the same model to. I'll get a lot of these with slightly different numbers. And if I ended up 6 months down the track having to change the results in a paper, it would take me a lot longer than 1 minute to figure out if there had been any typographical errors in my process of changing these results into my final output. The paper that I've just been talking about gives us a 7-step checklist of things that can be assessed in the performance of a data sharing and analysis platform. And so when I looked at it, I thought, you know, CoEsra is okay at data discovery. It's probably not as good as Oren at that particular step. However, it excels at data preparation, and it's basically its bread and butter is data analysis. So with that, I'll give you a bit of a demonstration of doing an area to point spatial data linkage. I was going to do an online demonstration or a video if the server is offline, but actually I spent so much time doing the video, and I know exactly how long they take. I'll show that to you, and I'll talk over the top. So you go to the website, www.coesra.org.au. We'll redirect to the portal, coesra.org.au, where you can register yourself based on the university or CSIRO that you work at. It's open to New Zealand universities as well. And if you can't do that, if you're from overseas, then the guys at UQ can set up an account for you. So don't worry too much about area of research. Humans are animals, so plants and animals works for me as well. And then I've already registered, so I don't have to wait. I can just log straight in. It's checking my credentials and granting access. Now I'm going to go straight to the groups section and request access to the CAR group, which takes a little while, so I'll pause that because what happens now is that the administrator gets notified and they have to give authorization. So now I've got access, I can go ahead and launch my desktop. It's just asking me to be aware that it's going to close after a couple of days, and that's fine because all of the data and code that I've been working on will still be available in my workspace. It just won't be a running computer. I'll talk about OwnCloud and Cloud Store later on, so don't worry about that. What we've got now is our Linux remote desktop being presented to us through the web browser. And I should note that it works mostly it works really well with Google Chrome. So we recommend that people only use Google Chrome. You can go through the public shared data folder to get to the shared research data. So now, once we've got access to our data, it's time to do some spatial data linkage. So here we go. I've put the shared research data for CAR, which is over on the left-hand side. And I'm going to open up my local projects, which is my own Canberra space. And I've already started a project on the air pollution in Western Sydney, particularly about PM2.5, which is particulates. I've got provided data there that was the locations of a bunch of street addresses that I want to look at particularly. And I've also started an RStudio project. So when I start that up, I can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it's just showing me exactly what we saw before, but now I can load up the code, run the code, look at the files, look at the plots. This script here is just doing from the graph from 1992, we know that we have point receptors and area sources. And it's interesting to think that areas are usually represented as vector data, as polygons, but it's the same principles operate on raster data, because the grid cells can be just seen as little square areas. So when I've got my script up, I can grab my own data pretty simply. That was loaded up in the previous step, but I need to find the exposure data that is available to me now that I'm part of the CAR group. So I go to the data inventory, opened it up in the web browser, and you can either go to the Cloud Store version and browse it browse through the data that's available there. It takes a bit of a long time to connect for some reason, so I've just gone back to the inventory and I'm going to browse through, have a look at how it's set up. That's the conventions. Have a bit of a look around. I can see there's ABS data, but I'm really interested in the PM2.5 surface that comes from the global data set that's described there in the abstract. And that link takes me directly to a folder where the data is stored. That's not as useful as this folder where there's a working quantum GIS file that I can actually use to visualize the data. So opening that up, I'll pause that because it's going to take a little while. Here we go. It's loaded up the global PM2.5 surface. Zoomed in on Sydney, you can see that that's also the stars are the pollutant monitors around Sydney. And now I've turned it off, you can see the satellite image of Sydney. So back to our script, I now know where the source data is and what it's called. I've copied the name of the file and I'll just paste that in there. It just needs to have the file type added. And the directory can be copied straight from here. That little glitch there was me using the Alt-Tab keys on my keyboard to try and toggle between the screens. That doesn't work when you're inside a web browser. You're basically toggling between your web browser, which is showing your desktop, and your other files. Anyway, back to the storyline. We've now loaded up the publicly available global PM2.5 data. We've shown it there in the bottom right-hand corner. We run a extraction tool, which takes a little while, so I'll pause that. That happened, and so we can assign it as a variable to our data set, giving it a more sensible name. PM2.5, the dots don't really work, so it's just PM2.5. Give it an output file name. Following our conventions of naming the projects, naming the kind of type of data set that it is and the time period that it's representing, and then writing that out into our data-derived area. Just checking that first to see if it exists, and it does, and that there's nothing in it, we can go ahead and write the output. So now that's happened, we could set this up as a loop, do multiple years. We could do it as a function where it could take different data sets, so not just PM2.5, but also NO2 or ozone. And here we are, we now can show it by browsing the file system as normal. That's the output file that we got, and putting it in here, here's the street addresses of all the people in Western Sydney around Liverpool, which was my study location that I chose to develop this for. Now the idea is that you would then get this out and use the street address of real people to link this environmental exposure, PM2.5 from 2011, to the health data in my own system back at my university, and I would continue with my the rest of my health analysis. So just showing that up here with the colors, you can see that with this particular data set, there's not a huge variation in PM 2.5 across that part of the city. And so what we're now able to do is link it to other data sets that we can generate from new measurements and from interesting techniques with satellite data, and put it all together, share it with other people by submitting it to the collaboration data manager for wider sharing, and write our paper. So this is just saving the map as a figure for that particular study region, and that's the end of that. So that was use case 1, area to point spatial data linkage. Use case 2 doesn't take as long, so it's just point-to-point spatial data linkage. Which started here. So again, we have on the left the main shared data set, data collection, which includes monitor data from New South Wales. We can go straight in there because we don't need to go to the data inventory if we've found it already, but we can click on a metadata document that is living there in the folder with these other things. It's just PDF, find out more about the data sets and their names. We can go straight to their location, look at their names. Shapefiles clog up folders pretty quick because there's always 4 or 5 different files related to a single shapefile, but that's the one I want. That's my point source. Now this is the receptor. I'm using a simulated data set here called zombies because a lot of the time what we don't want to do is work directly with health study participants' residential locations. This is because of privacy, and so I've made a simulated data set. In the previous example, I used all of the street addresses out of the GNAF, which is the G-coded national address file. And so that's one way to get around the problem, is just to estimate your exposures for every address in the study region and then link it to the ones that you actually need later on. In this one, I'm doing this just as a demonstration. This simulated data set kind of looks like what a study of zombies might give you as their addresses. So there's a bunch of different tools that are already in this zombies data set, and they are designed to kind of get you going quickly. This one's about doing a kriging model. So if you think back to the point-to-point process in the 1992 schema, it was basically doing a inverse distance weighted interpolation between the 2 points and giving you a value in between the middle of both of them. The kriging is a slightly more sophisticated inverse distance weighted interpolation which uses a spatial covariance model to estimate in a better way the values in between the 2 points. And so that's completed and spat out the TIFF, which can't be seen in your normal image software. It's a GeoTIFF. So if we open it in the QGIS project, actually I'm going to open it up in one that I've started before because I've done a bit of work on the style. So just ignoring that it's lost access to the original data set, we'll load that up again. But you can see it's got the points. Just to save time, I've done some styling here. And so all these pre-configured QGIS files can be shared. People can go through and look at what maps and zoom out and zoom in and add new data sets to them. I was having trouble dragging and dropping some stuff. And so that output was then, for each of the zombies locations, their estimated exposure from the points. So I've hardly got any time. It's 12:45. I've got about 5 minutes. So what I might do, I'll go quickly back to Coesra, which I've got loaded up here, and show what a mediated access. So the PM 2.5 that we used was global and public domain, but not very detailed. What we do have as well is some great data from the CSIRO, where there was a shipping based, or the focus was on shipping in Sydney. And so this is a Sydney PM2.5 surface that is much more spatially variable because of the kind of spatial modeling that was done by our colleague Martin Cope at the CSIRO. And so you can see that the access is restricted for this one. It is on the cloud store, but it's under this shared location, and so it's not immediately available. What you need to do if you want this is email the contact, which is myself, and explain who you are and what you want to do with it. Then Martin will have the option to get involved with you and maybe collaborate, or just give you the data and say, here you go, on your way. Once the approval is made, then it will show up in your own cloud. Is the way that Cloud Store is synchronized to your local. So you will have everyone who logs into Cloud Store gets a shared folder, and once you become an authorized user of the data set, it shows up in your shared folder, which is also available through the web interface. So you don't have to go into Coezra to use it if you don't want to. Just log in. Yeah. So that's the example of a mediated use case. So I've only got a couple of things left to do. I'm going to discuss the limitations that we've identified and then conclude. So one of the key limitations is, as I just mentioned, you might not want to go into the online system. Sometimes you can't. It might be off. Sometimes this is due to a disastrous reason, like the server died. It's getting backed up, so it will be restored at some point, but that can take time. And so that's a bit of a limitation, a bit of a risk. However, I should point out that that risk also exists locally inside universities on your desktop anyway. So everyone should be taking backup and disaster recovery pretty seriously. One of the implications of this is not available in airplanes. I myself have been up in the sky going to a conference and wanting to update the numbers on a slide. And so if you've got local data and local analytic code, you can easily get some new numbers, and you can't do that with this model. Well, you can, but you can't easily sync it back to the online system unless you're particularly diligent. It's currently free, which is a bonus, but it's a limitation in that the funding is uncertain into the future, and we hope that NCRIS will continue to fund it. It's probably not a huge cost to do this yourself using some of the paid services from people like Amazon or Microsoft Azure. So that's not really too much of a limitation, and a bit of a bonus that it's free at the moment. Focusing on open source software is pragmatic, so R, Python, Postgres, that's all fine. The licensed software like MATLAB, SAS, Data, that's more challenging to administer, and we haven't solved that problem yet. The follow-on from that is that you actually need a license to run Windows operating systems, and so software that's specific to that platform won't run, so ArcGIS won't be available. When you're actually getting into the nitty-gritty of working in the system, sometimes there's a lag between typing things on your keyboard and what you see on the screen. And this, if you've ever seen a proficient programmer writing some software, their keyboard's just going really fast. And so that can be very frustrating when the code isn't actually appearing on the screen in front of you. So then there's a solution there is to work in a kind of development mode offline and then push your development work into the online system. It becomes a trade-off between the comfort of working locally and the remote desktop chores, where you've got to have this kind of rigorous process of pushing your work up and then pulling it back down. This is important because actually a lot of developments in local computing have made it very comfortable, and the bespoke software and fast cores and big RAM is less of an issue to work on your local desktop now than it used to be. And so we're kind of entering a new phase where we are asking the question, should all of our researchers actually be able, should we just expect them to be able to use all of the software and the fast computers on their desktop if they really need to? And we sort out the data sharing some other way. So in conclusion, we've presented this secure online platform and as we designed it and as we hoped it would be. And it's designed to specifically link exposure data for environmental health studies. Uses the remote desktops, and this enhances our ability to access the data, the methods and the tools, and to share them. This mitigates the problems of reproducibility, as I described to begin with. However, further work is required to mitigate the problems of replication. So I'd like to acknowledge the funders, who were wide and many and varied, and in particular Jeff Morgan provided the last bit of funding to develop the group management system. So that's the end of my talk. Got about 10 minutes for questions if anyone's got any comments or questions. Happy to take them in the chat box.
Thank you, Ivan. It was a very interesting presentation. Now, as you said, we have time to take a few questions, and it would be great if you can use the chat section at the bottom of the GoToMeeting panel to write your questions and then to type it there, and then Ivan will read it loud and answer the question. So while we're waiting, Ivan, for people to think of questions, I have a question myself. You touched on the commercially available systems like Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Computing. So how do you compare this system with those commercially available services?
Well, they give you the service as a virtual machine. They don't give you the software configuration or the manager or the person who develops and configures the setup, unless you pay extra for that. So you can basically get a raw Linux server from those guys, and then you still have to pay for a software developer, a sysadmin, and a data manager. So that's the key difference, I would say. We're getting all the infrastructure for free from our national NCRIS funding scheme, and the colleagues at UQ have been giving us the software support. So really, but it's not free. The infrastructure was paid for, just not by us.
Right. Thank you.
Apart from that, there's not really much difference between the infrastructure that Amazon and Microsoft will give you, except Microsoft will give you a Windows machine.
Right. So, any questions from anyone?
It's open for people to have a go. Just go and register. Have a poke around as an open data platform, and if you're allowed, then request access, and I'll give it to you. Thanks, Luke. Luke's been involved in a lot of the discussions leading up to this, and he's also pretty pleased to see it running now in a public alpha phase.
Ivan,
has anyone used Oren? Talking a bit more about the metadata and the protocol to access specific data sets. Yeah, it remains a challenge to serve the metadata in a really accessible way for searching. Like I said, the metadata conforms to an international standard that's being used in a lot of the portals that are set up in ecology. So you can search these things on keywords, on temporal extent, on spatial extent, and on specific data dimensions, like what pollutants or whatnot. We have data sharing arrangements where if you are going to give us data to share, you have to describe it using the standard, and so there's a metadata document that you can fill out, and that's all pretty standard. It's a bit boring, but once that's happened, so everyone who's done that will have been asked the question, is there any restrictions on sharing this? Is there a license? And so if you want to control access to specific data sets, like for very good reasons, the the data sets might be difficult to use or have specific things that the original data creator wants to make sure is understood. So all you might have to do for the data sharing agreement from a user perspective is just to agree to let the data creator know how you're using it. And the benefit in the feedback from that is that the data creator might actually provide some very useful words for a methods section that describes the data for a paper, because downstream users potentially aren't in the best place to describe the data sets in the journal paper. At some point, writing all that, the data creator then becomes a co-author, and so that's an agreement that needs to be made as well. So Luke's put in a note, he's done validation on that global PM data. There were several issues, and we're going to discuss it when we all go to Melbourne next week. So that's an issue that can be then added to the metadata, so that further users could see that that data is freely available in the system. It's been reviewed by experts in the field, and there's some issues that have been raised, and there's an alternate that's available, and that so there, if you've found it and you go, this looks great, I wonder if it's the best thing I can use, you read the metadata, you go, oh yeah, it's okay for some purposes but maybe not others, and there's an alternate thing that I can ask for specific user agreement with, and then that links you through to that better, potentially more suitable data set. So that's Luke. Guyan says, does COESRA include any international data as well? Well, the global PM one is global, but the focus of the collaboration's data collection is national. But there's no reason why, if you wanted to share global data or international data for another nation, you could just put it up there. Yeah, Luke, global NDVI, I mean, it depends on the resources available for the data management team. A lot of the documentation tasks fall to the data management team, because people who might provide data are keen to get it out there and get it used, but they've got a lot of other competing priorities on their time. And so putting up a data set isn't as simple as just saying, here's the, well, it can be as simple as just saying, here's the folder, there's some data in it, it should be self-explanatory. However, often that's suboptimal. So I've only got a couple more minutes left, but I love talking about this. I could talk about it for another hour. So if you wanted to call me up or catch me at the big car face-to-face in Melbourne next week, do that. And there's also a paper I mentioned about the original development of COESRA, which is worth a read. It gets a bit technical on the computer science side of things, but it really also does a great job of explaining how this is meeting a need in ecology right now.
Thanks again, Ivan, for the interesting talk, and thanks to all who attended today's webinar. I would like to mention that today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on CAR's website. So if there is no more questions and no more comments from you, Ivan, you can conclude today's webinar.
No, thanks very much. The next phase is a data audit, where we will look around the collaboration and the nation and the world. So get in touch if you've got some data you really want to share. I know Gavin Pereira's pretty much first off the cab rank in sharing data with us pretty soon. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Christine. Do I need to finish, Farhad, or is it?
Yeah, I think we can now conclude, yes. Thanks a lot, Ivan. Thank you, everybody, for...
Thank you, Farhad.
See you all.